The lock clicked with a sound like a gunshot, sealing me inside the dark interior of the SUV. I pressed my spine against the cold leather of the passenger door, making myself as small as possible, waiting for the blow. Waiting for the screaming. But the man beside me didn't scream. He just, breathed. A low, vibrating rumble that seemed to rattle my very bones. He was massive, his shoulders blocking out the streetlights, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned in protest. The air in the car grew hot, suffocating, smelling of rain, and something wild, something dangerous. I flinched when he shifted gears, squeezing my eyes shut. "Open your eyes," he growled, his voice deep and rough, like gravel grinding together. "Look at me." I shook my head, terrified. I said, "Look at me," he commanded, softer this time, but with an edge that brooked no argument. "You aren't his anymore, Elena. You're mine, and I don't break what belongs to me." My heart hammered against my ribs, not just from fear, but from a strange, twisting heat that coiled low in my stomach. I was trapped with a monster, so why did I feel safer in this car than I ever had in my own home? Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. Get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into the rain with a ruthless Alpha King who will burn the world down to keep his mate. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the Rain. The rain was a cold, relentless slap against my cheek, a perfect match for the throbbing ache beneath the layer of cheap concealer I'd applied that morning. I hurried through the slick streets, clutching the paper grocery bag to my chest like it held gold bars instead of bruised apples and a loaf of day-old bread. My life had become a series of gray, suffocating moments stitched together by fear, a constant dull thrum that settled deep in the marrow of my bones. But today, the gray felt charged. The air wasn't just heavy with moisture, it was heavy with intent. I could feel it prickling the fine hairs on the back of my neck, a sensation so sharp it was almost a physical touch, like a hot breath against frozen skin. It wasn't the usual paranoia that came from living with a man who used his fists as punctuation marks. This was different. This felt like being hunted by something that didn't just want to hurt me, but wanted to consume me whole. I turned the final corner toward the crumbling apartment complex that served as my prison, my wet sneakers squeaking pitifully against the cracked pavement. And there it was. The car looked less like a vehicle and more like a weapon carved from midnight shadows, idling silently against the curb. It was a massive, sleek beast of a machine that cost more than this entire neighborhood combined, completely out of place amidst the rusted sedans and broken streetlights. The engine purred with a low subterranean vibration that I felt in the soles of my feet, a dangerous growl that made my heart hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I should have kept my head down. That was the first rule of survival. Be invisible, be silent, be nothing. But a strange magnetic force jerked my chin up, compelling me to look at the dark tint of the driver's side window. As if on command, the glass slid down just a few inches, revealing a slice of the interior. I couldn't see his face clearly in the gloom, but I saw his eyes. They were a shocking molten gold, burning with a ferocity that made my knees buckle. He wasn't just looking at me, he was dissecting me. There was a raw, masculine hunger in that gaze that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. My body, usually frozen in a state of perpetual numbness, betrayed me instantly. A flush of heat, totally inappropriate and terrifyingly intense, flooded my veins, pooling low in my stomach and making my breath hitch. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, we just stared at each other, the soaking wet broken housewife and the predator in the luxury cage. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't move. He just radiated a dark, possessive energy that whispered promises of violence and salvation in equal measure. Then the window rolled up, sealing him away, but the heat of his attention lingered on my skin like a brand. I scrambled toward the building's entrance, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the groceries. I told myself it was just fear. I told myself I was losing my mind. But deep down, the dormant instincts I didn't know I possessed were screaming that something fundamental had just shifted in the universe. I fumbled with the keys, practically falling into the apartment, desperate to put a locked door between me and those golden eyes. The living room smelled of stale beer and unwashed laundry, the familiar scent of my misery. Carl was sitting on the lumpy sofa, nursing a bottle of whiskey, but for once, he wasn't glaring at the television. He was smiling. And that was infinitely more terrifying than his anger. His smile was wet and sloppy, his eyes bright with a manic, drunken glint that set every alarm bell in my head ringing. He looked at me not with his usual disdain, but with the greedy satisfaction of a man who had just won a bet he had no business making. "You're late," he slurred, but the venom was absent, replaced by a sickening sort of glee. He stood up, swaying slightly, and gestured grandly around the squalid room as if it were a palace. "Doesn't matter, though. None of this matters anymore, Elena. I fixed it. I fixed everything." I stood frozen by the door, the damp grocery bag soaking through my shirt, water dripping from my nose. "What did you do, Carl?" I whispered, my voice trembling. And the memory of the golden-eyed stranger outside flashed in my mind, and a cold pit of dread opened in my stomach. Carl laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I paid the debt, every last cent. The sharks won't be coming for my knees anymore." He took a step toward me, his expression twisting into something cruel and triumphant. "I made a deal with a very powerful man. He's outside right now. He wanted something, and I gave it to him." My blood ran cold, the heat from the street vanishing instantly. "What did you give him, Carl?" He grinned, showing his yellowed teeth. "You." Chapter 2. Sold to the Beast. The air in the room curdled, thick with the scent of Carl's cheap whiskey and the metallic tang of my own terror. "You? You sold me?" I whispered, the words feeling foreign and jagged in my mouth. Before Carl could answer, the single light bulb dangling from the ceiling flickered and died, plunging us into a heavy, suffocating darkness. Then came the sound. Not a knock, but a wet, crunching impact that tore the front door off its hinges with the ease of peeling a stubborn orange. The wood screamed and splintered, and the storm outside roared into our living room, bringing with it a figure that seemed woven from the night itself. He stepped over the debris of my front door, shaking the rain from his coat like a massive, irritated wolf. Even in the gloom, he was terrifyingly distinct. He was taller than the doorframe, broader than any man had a right to be, and radiating a heat that I could feel from across the room. It was him, the man from the car. The golden eyes found me instantly, unlocking onto my face with a terrifying intensity that made my knees knock together. He ignored Carl completely, treating my husband like a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently in his path. He just walked toward me, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards with a rhythmic, predatory grace that made the breath catch in my throat. "You can't just break in here," Carl stammered, his earlier bravado melting into a puddle of pathetic whining. He scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of old newspapers. "We had a deal. You pay the debt, I give you the girl. That was the deal." The stranger stopped, slowly turning his head to look at Carl. The movement was smooth, lethal, and utterly dismissive. A low sound rumbled in his chest, something between a growl and a dark chuckle, vibrating through the floorboards and straight up my spine. It was a sound that promised violence, yet strangely, it didn't make me want to run. It made me want to get closer. "The debt is paid," the stranger said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to wrap around my senses like warm velvet. "But I don't like loose ends." With a speed that blurred the air, he moved. One moment, he was standing still. The next, his hand was wrapped around Carl's throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing more than a wet rag. Carl gagged, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. The stranger leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear, before casually tossing my husband across the room. Carl hit the wall with a sickening thud and slid down, unconscious, before he even hit the floor. Silence descended, heavy and charged. And the stranger turned back to me, adjusting his cuffs as if he hadn't just assaulted a man. He closed the distance between us, stealing the air from my lungs. Up close, he smelled of rain, expensive leather, and something wild, like cedar and ozone. He reached out, his large, rough hand hovering near my face, and for a second I thought he would strike me. I flinched, bracing for the impact, but his fingers merely brushed a stray lock of wet hair from my cheek. The touch was scorching, sending a jolt of electricity straight to my core that made my toes curl. "Pack your things," he commanded, his golden eyes burning into mine with a possessive fire that terrified and thrilled me. "You belong to me now." Chapter 3. The King's Prisoner. The drive was a lesson in suffocating intimacy. I was trapped in the passenger seat of his sleek, as black SUV, the leather soft as butter beneath my trembling fingers. Outside, the world was a blur of rain and darkness, but inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to chew on. The stranger, he hadn't told me his name, and I was too terrified to ask, drove with a casual, arrogant skill. His hands on the steering wheel were large and scarred, veins cording along his forearms as he navigated the winding roads. I couldn't stop staring at them. Those were hands that had just crushed a man's windpipe without trembling. Yet they held the wheel with a strange, controlled delicacy. Every time he shifted gears, his arm brushed against the fabric of my wet coat, sending fresh waves of that confusing, treacherous heat through my body. "Take a picture, little human," he rumbled suddenly, not taking his eyes off the road. "It lasts longer." My cheeks flamed so hot I thought they might actually ignite. I snapped my head toward the window, staring resolutely at the nothingness outside. "I wasn't staring," I lied, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet car. He let out a short, dry huff of laughter that sounded suspiciously like a bark. "You were. You're trying to figure out if I'm going to kill you or keep you." The bluntness of his words made my stomach flip. "Which is it?" I asked, surprising myself with the boldness. He didn't answer immediately. The car slowed as we turned through a massive iron gate, flanked by stone gargoyles that seemed to leer at us in the headlights. A winding driveway stretched ahead, leading up to a house that looked like it had been ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel. It was a fortress of dark stone and towering spires, brooding against the stormy sky. "I don't kill things that are useful to me," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming rougher, darker. "And you, Elena, are going to be very useful." The way his name for me rolled off his tongue, possessive, heavy, intimate, made my thighs clench involuntarily. God, I was losing my mind. I was a hostage, and my body was reacting like I was on a first date with the devil himself. He parked the car in front of the massive double doors and came around to open mine before I could even undo the seatbelt. He didn't drag me out. He offered me a hand. I stared at it, that wide palm, those long fingers, and hesitantly placed my hand in his. The contact was electric. A spark zapped us both, and I saw his jaw tighten, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He pulled me out, his grip firm but not painful, and led me up the stone steps. The house was even more intimidating inside. Vaulted ceilings, marble floors, and shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for us. It was cold, silent, and overwhelmingly masculine. He led me up a grand staircase, down a long hallway, lined with portraits of stern-looking men who all shared his intense eyes, and pushed open a door at the end of the corridor. The room was beautiful. A four-poster bed, a roaring fireplace, heavy velvet drapes, but as I stepped inside, I heard the distinctive click of the lock sliding home behind me. I spun around, rushing to the heavy oak door, gripping the brass handle. It wouldn't budge. "Open it!" I shouted, pounding my fist against the wood. "You can't keep me here." From the other side, a guttural roar vibrated through the wood, a sound of pure, frustrated aggression that shook the pictures on the walls. "Get some sleep, Elena." His voice came through the timber, sounding strained, as if he were fighting a war within himself. "Because tomorrow, your new life begins." Chapter 4. The Ultimatum. I woke up tangled in sheets that cost more than my entire existence. For a disorienting moment, I thought I was back in the lumpy twin bed at the apartment, bracing for the sound of Carl's heavy footsteps. But the silence here was absolute, heavy, and expensive. The memories of the night before crashed into me. The rain, the golden eyes, the lock clicking shut. I sat up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, just as the key turned in the lock. The door swung open, and he filled the frame. In the daylight, he was even more devastating. He was wearing a crisp white shirt that strained against the width of his shoulders, the top buttons undone to reveal a tantalizing glimpse of tan skin and dark ink. He looked like a king, and I looked like a drowned rat wrapped in Egyptian cotton. He didn't say good morning. He simply walked in, followed by a terrified-looking maid carrying a tray of food that smelled like heaven: bacon, eggs, fresh coffee. He dismissed her with a sharp nod and waited until the door closed before turning those golden laser beams on me. "Eat," he commanded, dragging a heavy wooden chair to the side of the bed and straddling it backward, his arms resting on the backrest, his intense gaze pinning me to the mattress. "We have business to discuss." I pulled the sheet up to my chin, feeling exposed despite being fully clothed. I'm not hungry," I lied, my stomach immediately betraying me with a loud, treacherous growl. His lips twitched, a microscopic crack in the stone facade. "Liar," he murmured, pushing the tray closer. "Eat, Elena. You're too thin. I can snap you in half with one hand, and while that might be fun in other circumstances, it's not what I need right now." The casual innuendo hung in the air, thick and smoky. My face heated. "What do you need?" I asked, grabbing a piece of toast just to have something to do with my hands. "Why did you buy me? What do you want?" He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards, and began to pace the room like a caged tiger. "I didn't buy you. I acquired a debt," he corrected. His voice clipped. "And what I need is a solution to a problem." He stopped at the foot of the bed, gripping the wooden post until his knuckles turned white. "My counsel is restless. They believe an unmarried alpha is an unstable alpha. They want me to take a mate to secure the bloodline." He looked at me then, his eyes darkening, swirling with a mixture of resentment and hunger. "I need a wife, Elena, and you need protection. It's a simple transaction." "A wife?" I choked on my toast. "You want to marry me? You don't even know me. I'm damaged goods, mister. You saw where I lived. You saw him." I gestured vaguely to the past. "I can't be a wife. I'm broken." The air in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. He moved so fast I didn't see him cross the distance. Suddenly, he was looming over me, planting his hands on the mattress on either side of my hips, trapping me against the headboard. His face was inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling of coffee and mint. "Do not," he growled, his voice vibrating in my chest. "Call yourself broken. You are a survivor. And I don't want a soft, perfect princess. I want someone who knows how to endure." He leaned closer, his nose brushing against mine, the sexual tension spiking so high I thought I might faint. "You will marry me, Elena. You will wear my ring. You will live in my house. And you will pretend to be the love of my life until my throne is secure." I tried to shrink back, but there was nowhere to go. "And if I refuse?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. His golden eyes flared, and for a second, his pupils dilated into vertical slits. "Refusal isn't an option," he murmured against my lips, so close he was almost kissing me. It wasn't a request, little human. It was a command. Chapter 5. Rules of the House. The echo of Roman's command seemed to hang in the vaulted ceiling of my bedroom long after the heavy oak door had clicked shut behind him. It wasn't a request. The arrogance of it should have made me furious. But 7 years of walking on eggshells had trained me to convert fury into survival instincts. I wasn't going to just sit on this cloud-like mattress and wait for my new owner to return. I needed to know the layout of my cage. I slipped out into the hallway, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. It was a mausoleum of dark wood and stone, beautiful in a cold, imposing way that screamed of old money and older secrets. I passed a maid polishing a banister, a petite woman who took one look at me, paled as if she'd seen a ghost, and scurried away without a word. Her reaction sent a shiver down my spine. People didn't look at guests like that. They looked at prisoners like that. Or sacrifices. I wandered aimlessly, my fingers trailing over tapestries that felt older than my entire bloodline, until I found a set of double doors left slightly ajar. A rich, masculine scent drifted out. Tobacco, aged paper, and that distinct cedar and rain smell that clung to Roman like a second skin. It was his study. Every instinct screamed danger, but my curiosity was a traitor. I slipped inside. The room was massive, dominated by a desk the size of a small car and walls lined with books. But it wasn't the books that caught my eye. It was the scatter of manila folders on the desk, looking hasty and disorganized in an otherwise pristine room. I crept closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I can flip the top folder open. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful whoosh. It was me. Not me now, but me from 3 months ago. There were grainy photos of me walking to the laundromat, struggling with grocery bags in the rain, sitting on a park bench with my head in my hands. He hadn't just acquired a debt yesterday. He had been watching me, stalking me, documenting my misery with the cold precision of a scientist studying a lab rat. A wave of nausea rolled over me. This wasn't a business transaction. This was an obsession. I was so absorbed in the horror of the photographs, a zoom lens shot of a bruise on my arm, that I didn't hear the door close. I didn't hear him move. I only felt the sudden oppressive shift in air pressure, the temperature in the room spiking as if a furnace had been kicked open. Curiosity killed the cat, Elena. His voice rumbled from directly behind me, so close his chest brushed my back. I froze, the file slipping from my numb fingers to scatter across the desk. I waited for the blow. I waited for the shouting. But instead of violence, I felt his nose graze the sensitive skin behind my ear, inhaling deeply. But satisfaction brought it back, he whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr that vibrated straight through my spine and settled heavily between my legs. He wasn't looking at the photos. He was looking at me, or rather, sensing me. His hands came up, gripping the edge of the desk on either side of my hips, trapping me in a cage of muscle and heat. "You smell like fear," he murmured, his lips ghosting over my neck, making my skin break out in gooseflesh. And something else. Something sweet. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, his body a wall of heat radiating into my back. Why were you hiding in the shadows, little thief? Were you looking for a way out, or were you looking for me? Chapter 6. A Dinner in Silence. Dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare, staged at a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. Roman sat at the head, looking like a dark god of gluttony and wrath, while I sat to his right, feeling like the sacrificial lamb. The only sounds in the cavernous dining hall were the clinking of silverware and the crackling of the fire in the massive hearth. I pushed a pea around my plate, my appetite completely destroyed by the earlier encounter in the study. Every time I looked up, I found him staring at me. He wasn't eating. He was watching me eat. In his golden eyes tracking the movement of my fork to my mouth with a predatory intensity that made swallowing difficult. It felt less like a meal, and more like I was performing for an audience of one, and the critic was a man who could snap my neck with his thumb. "You're not eating," he stated flatly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't a question. He reached for his wine glass, his knuckles scarred and rough, a stark contrast to the delicate crystal. "The chef prepared this specifically for you." He was under the impression that humans require sustenance to survive. Though looking at you, perhaps you survive on air and anxiety. I bristled at the condescension, stabbing a piece of steak a little too hard. "I'm not hungry," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "And I'm not used to... in this." I gestured vaguely at the opulent room, the multiple forks, the terrifying man watching me chew. "I'm used to eating toast over a sink while my husband yells at the TV." The temperature in the room plummeted. Roman's hand tightened around his steak knife, the metal groaning under the pressure. "He didn't let you eat at the table?" The question was soft, dangerous. "He didn't let me do a lot of things," I admitted, my voice small. "He said I made too much noise, said I was clumsy." I looked down at my plate, shame heating my cheeks. Suddenly, Roman's chair scraped violently against the floor. Before I could flinch, he was standing over me. He took my plate, grabbed my knife and fork, and began cutting my steak into bite-sized pieces. His movements were aggressive, almost violent. As the knife slicing through the meat with unnecessary force, yet the act itself was caretaking? It was the most confusing display of nurturing I had ever witnessed. He slid the plate back in front of me, leaning down until his face was level with mine. His eyes were swirling with a dark molten gold that seemed to glow in the dim light. "You make as much noise as you want," he growled, the command rough and low. "You clatter the forks, you break the plates, you scream if you have to. In this house, you are not a ghost, Elena. You are the queen." He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint old scar on my jawline. A souvenir from Carl's ring 3 years ago. His touch was scorching, a brand of possession. "And if anyone ever tries to make you feel small again," he whispered, his lips inches from mine, like the promise hanging heavy and thick in the air between us, "I will tear the world apart until there is nothing left but you and me." Eat. Chapter 7. The fever begins. I woke up drowning in fire. It started as a subtle prickle beneath my skin, like a sunburn that wouldn't fade. But by midnight, it had roared into a full-blown inferno. I kicked off the heavy duvet, gasping for air, my nightgown clinging to my sweat-dampened skin. The flu, I thought deliriously, stumbling out of bed. Stress and the rain have finally caught up with me. I needed air. The room felt like a kiln, the walls closing in, pressing the heat deeper into my bones. I fumbled with the latch of the French doors and stumbled out onto the stone balcony, hoping the night air would cool the fever raging in my blood. But even the wind felt warm, heavy with moisture and the scent of jasmine and him. That cedar and rain scent was everywhere, thicker out here than inside, pulling at me with a magnetic hook I was too weak to resist. I didn't stop at the balcony. I found myself walking barefoot through the wet grass of the sprawling gardens, drawn toward the tree line like a moth to a flame. The moonlight turned the estate into a landscape of silver and shadows, beautiful and eerie. My head was spinning, a rhythmic thumping in my ears that matched the frantic beat of my heart. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't just my heart. It sounded like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I spun around, swaying dizzily, and saw a shadow detach itself from the gloom of the rose garden. Roman. He was watching me again, standing perfectly still, his eyes glowing like twin embers in the dark. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just a thin white shirt that was translucent in the rain, clinging to the expanse of his chest. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice strained, sounding like he was speaking through gritted teeth. He didn't move closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Go back inside, Elena. Lock the door." I tried to focus on him, but the world tilted on its axis. "I'm burning," I whispered, the words slurring. "I think I'm sick." The heat inside me flared, a sudden sharp cramp that doubled me over. I let out a soft cry, my knees giving way. I waited to hit the wet grass, but the impact never came. He was there in a blur of motion, moving faster than humanly possible. His arms scooped me up before I could fall, pulling me hard against his chest. And that was the mistake. But the moment my skin touched his, bare arm against bare arm, it wasn't relief. It was an explosion. A shockwave of pure white-hot static blasted through me, so intense it knocked the breath from my lungs. It wasn't pain. It was pleasure so acute it bordered on agony. I gasped, arching into him, my body recognizing something my mind couldn't comprehend. Roman groaned, a sound torn from the depths of his chest, his head falling back as if he'd been struck. "Damn it!" he hissed, his grip on me tightening until it bruised, his restraint shattering like glass. "I told you to run, little human. Now it's too late." Chapter 8. The Alpha's Restraint. The journey from the garden to my bedroom was a blur of rain, muscle, and a heat so intense I felt like I was being forged in a kiln. Roman carried me as if I weighed nothing more than a wet towel, his arms acting as bands of steel beneath my knees and back. Every step he took was a tectonic shift, a purposeful stride that jarred my teeth. Yet his hold on me was terrifyingly gentle. I was delirious, my head lolling against a chest that felt like a slab of granite, listening to the thunderous, erratic rhythm of his heart. It was beating too fast, a frantic staccato drumline that matched the chaotic pulsing in my own veins. I should have been petrified. I was in the arms of a man who had admitted to stalking me, a man who radiated violence like a furnace radiates heat, but my traitorous body only wanted to burrow closer. The fever burning through me wasn't just sickness. It was a craving, a magnetic pull that made the inch of space between our skin feel like a canyon I needed to cross. And he kicked the bedroom door open with a violence that made the wood groan, striding to the massive bed and depositing me onto the mattress. The moment his arms left me, I felt a physical loss, a cold snap that made my teeth chatter. I curled into a ball, shivering, watching him through half-lidded eyes. He didn't leave immediately. He stood by the bed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. Water dripped from his dark hair, landing on the expensive rug, but he didn't seem to notice. He was staring at me, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of hunger and something that looked painfully like restraint. He looked like a man starving to death, in front of a banquet he was forbidden to touch. "Stay here," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. I'll send the maid with water. I need to go." He turned to leave, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet fighting its strings. Panic, sharp and irrational, spiked in my chest. The idea of him leaving, of the cold rushing back in, was unbearable. "No!" The word tore from my throat before I could stop it. I scrambled up, my coordination shot, and grabbed his wrist. His skin was scorching hot, burning even through the fever haze. He froze instantly, his entire body going rigid as stone. "Don't go," I whispered, the plea humiliating but necessary. "Please, I'm scared of the dark house. Just stay." Roman looked at my hand on his wrist, then slowly up to my face. The conflict in his expression was devastating. A war between the monster who wanted to devour and the man who wanted to protect. He let out a long, ragged breath, a sound of defeat, and slowly sank into the heavy velvet armchair in the corner of the room. "I'm not a nursemaid, Elena," he growled, though the bite was gone from his tone. replaced by a weary resignation. And I am certainly not safe company for a woman in your condition. But he didn't leave. He sat there in the shadows, a dark, brooding sentinel, his eyes glowing faintly as the storm raged outside. I drifted off to the sound of the rain and his steady breathing, feeling safer with the monster in the chair than I ever had with the human in the bed next to me. Chapter 9. The Council's Visit. I woke to the sound of voices downstairs, sharp, angry, and distinctly unwelcome. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving me feeling scrubbed raw but strangely energized, like a wire stripped of its insulation. And I washed my face, avoiding the mirror because I knew I looked like a wreck, and followed the noise. It led me to the grand foyer, where Roman stood like a dark monolith in front of 3 older men in gray suits. They didn't look like businessmen. They looked like vultures circling a carcass. They were arguing, their voices echoing off the marble floors. But Roman was silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of bored indifference. "This is an insult to the lineage, Roman," one of the men spat. A thin, wiry fellow with eyes like beads of oil. "You bring a stray into the Blackwood estate? A human stray? We demanded a mate, not a pet. She is weak, she has no breeding, and she smells of—" He wrinkled his nose, searching for the word. "Broken things. You cannot possibly intend to bond with her. And she wouldn't survive the first heat, let alone birth an heir." I froze on the landing, my hand gripping the banister. Weak. Broken. Pet. The words were familiar, echoes of what Carl used to say, but hearing them here, in this house where I had started to feel a flicker of safety, felt like a slap. I wanted to retreat, to hide in the shadows as I always did, but something hot and defiant flared in my gut. Before I could move, the air in the foyer suddenly changed. It became heavy, oppressive, thickening with a pressure that popped my ears. Roman hadn't moved a muscle, but the atmosphere around him had turned lethal. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, darkening the room. "Careful, Silas," Roman said softly. The volume was low, but the tone carried a frequency that vibrated in my teeth. And it was the sound of a predator right before the kill. "You are speaking about my wife. And while I tolerate your presence because of ancient laws, I do not tolerate disrespect." He took a single step forward, and the 3 men flinched simultaneously, stepping back as if physically pushed. "She is not a pet. She is the woman I chose. And if you ever speak of her breeding again, I will remind you why the council fears my bloodline." The threat was explicit, terrifying, and undeniably sexy. My breath hitched. He wasn't just defending his reputation, he was defending me. The vultures scrambled to apologize, their arrogance evaporating under the weight of his rage. As they hurried out the door, muttering nervous excuses, Roman turned. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted, his jaw tight. He looked up, his gaze locking instantly onto where I stood on the stairs. He knew I was there. He had known the whole time. "Eavesdropping is a bad habit, Elena," he called up, his voice losing its lethal edge and softening into something warmer, darker. "Come down here. If you're going to be the topic of conversation, you might as well stand beside me while I terrorize them." Chapter 10. The Scent of Change. 2 days passed, and the world had sharpened. That was the only way I could describe it. The colors in the gardens seemed too bright. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer against an anvil, and I could smell everything. I could smell the lemon polish the maids used 3 rooms away. I could smell the damp earth of the forest before I even opened the window. And most disturbingly, I could smell Roman. Not just his cologne, but him. A rich, complex scent of wood smoke, rain, and raw power that clung to the furniture, the sheets, and the air he walked through. It was intoxicating and maddening. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought maybe he was drugging the water, Or perhaps the stress of the abduction had finally snapped my fragile psyche. I found him in the library, staring out the window at the dense forest that bordered the estate. He was wearing a casual gray sweater that hugged his biceps in a way that should be illegal, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. I stormed in, abandoning my usual caution. "What did you do to me?" I demanded, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet room. "I feel wrong. I hear things I shouldn't hear. I smell things that aren't there. Did you drug me? Och, is this some kind of sick game to make me compliant?" Roman turned slowly, swirling the liquid in his glass. He didn't look surprised by my outburst. In fact, a faint smirk played on his lips, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I haven't drugged you, Elena. Though I admire the fire. It suits you better than the fear." He set the glass down and walked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't stop until he was crowding my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to look him in the eye. "Tell me," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were inches from my ear. "What do you smell right now?" I shivered, the reaction instantaneous and traitorous. "I smell pine," I stammered, my heart racing, "and old paper, and you." "And what do I smell like?" he whispered, his nose grazing the sensitive skin of my neck, inhaling deeply. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core, making my knees weak. "Trouble," I breathed, unable to lie. "You smell like trouble." He chuckled, a dark rumbling sound against my skin. Close, but not quite. He pulled back slightly, his golden eyes serious now, stripping away my defenses layer by layer. "You're changing, Elena. The proximity to me, the bond. It's waking something up that has been asleep in your blood for a long time." He reached out, his thumb brushing my lower lip, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "You aren't just human, little broken thing. You have wolf blood. And that," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, hungry growl, "is going to be a very big problem for both of us. Because I don't know if I can keep my hands off you much longer." Chapter 11. The Truth Revealed. The air in the library felt like it had been replaced by pure electricity, making the hair on my arms stand on end. "Wolf blood?" I repeated, the words tasting like copper and disbelief. "That's impossible. My parents were human. My life was mundane. Aside from the misery, it was perfectly boringly human." I tried to step back, to put some distance between my racing heart and his overwhelming heat. But Roman followed, a shadow that refused to be cast off. He moved with a grace that I now realized wasn't just athletic. It was predatory. Every twitch of his muscle, every tilt of his head was calibrated for a world I didn't know existed. He was a king in a world of monsters, and he was telling me I was one of them. It was absurd, at a joke told by a cruel god, yet my body was already nodding in agreement, humming a low, vibrating note of recognition that resonated in my very bones. "Your great-grandmother, Elena," Roman said, his voice dropping to a low melodic register that felt like a caress against my raw nerves. "She was a shifter who chose to live among humans. The gene can sleep for generations, skipping over the weak until it finds a vessel strong enough to carry the weight of the wolf. It was dormant in you, a flicker of coal waiting for a spark." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my throat where my pulse was jumping like a trapped bird. "I am that spark. My presence, my scent, the sheer pressure of my alpha blood is forcing your biology to catch up with your destiny. That fever wasn't the flu. It was your body breaking itself down to build something stronger." The intensity in his golden eyes was terrifying, a molten heat that seemed to see right through my skin to the DNA shifting beneath. I looked at his hand, huge, scarred, and capable of such effortless violence, and then at my own, which was trembling. "So what now? I just sprout fur and start howling at the moon?" My attempt at dark humor fell flat, my voice cracking at the end. Roman didn't laugh. He stepped closer, his chest brushing against the tips of my breasts. A contact so electric it made my vision blur. "Not yet," he whispered, his breath hot against my lips. "The transition is incomplete. It requires a catalyst. It requires the bond to be sealed." He leaned in, his nose grazing mine, and for a moment, yes, I thought he was going to devour me right there among the dusty books. "I didn't want this, Elena. I spent years avoiding the tether of a mate because I knew I would be a tyrant to anyone I loved. I thought I could use you, keep you as a shield against my counsel, and remain untouched." He let out a jagged, self-deprecating laugh that vibrated in his chest. "But fate is a sarcastic bitch. The more I try to push you away, the more I want to claim every inch of you. I'm trying to save you from the monster I am, but your blood is screaming for me to ruin you." He gripped my waist, his fingers digging into my skin with a possessive force that should have been painful, but instead felt like a homecoming. The sexual tension was a physical weight, a suffocating, delicious pressure that made me want to scream and beg all at once. I looked up at him, seeing the cracks in his armor, the raw vulnerability hidden behind his ruthless alpha mask. He wasn't just a captor, he was a man terrified of his own capacity to love. I reached up, my hand trembling as I touched his jaw, and felt the sandpaper grit of his stubble. "Maybe I don't want to be saved," I whispered. Roman's eyes flared, the gold turning to a deep burnt orange. Chapter 12. Breaking the Distance. The atmosphere in the house shifted after the revelation in the library. The business transaction had died a quiet death, replaced by a domestic tension so thick you could carve it into blocks. Roman stopped locking my door. Instead, he started opening his heart, or at least the heavy iron-bound doors that guarded it. He took me to the estate's private wing, a place even the maids didn't go, in showing me a conservatory filled with strange moon-blooming flowers that smelled like vanilla and secrets. We spent hours in silence that wasn't heavy or fearful, but expectant. I watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration as he signed decrees and barked orders into a phone, and realized that his mad rage was often just the exhaustion of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. He was a protector who had never been protected, a boy who had built a fortress around himself so high that he'd forgotten how to let anyone in. "Stop staring, Elena," he murmured one afternoon without looking up from his ledger. I was curled in a large leather armchair by the fire, a book forgotten in my lap. "It's distracting. I can feel your eyes on me, like a physical touch." I didn't look away, and the fear that had defined my life for 7 years was being replaced by a bold, shimmering curiosity. "What if I want to distract you?" I countered, the flirtation feeling new and dangerous on my tongue. Roman's pen paused. He slowly looked up, his gaze dark and hooded. "You have no idea the fire you're playing with," he warned, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "I have spent a lifetime perfecting my restraint. Don't make me break it." He stood up and walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a leopard stalking its lunch. He stopped in front of my chair, looming over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. He reached down and took the book from my lap, tossing it onto the side table without breaking eye contact. "You think you know me because I rescued you from a pathetic human," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But I am not a hero. I am a man who has been alone for a very long time, and I am currently looking at the only thing in the world that makes me want to stop being a king and start being a man." The air between us was saturated with longing, a magnetic pull so strong it was almost painful. He reached out, his hand hovering over my cheek, before finally settling there, his thumb tracing the curve of my ear. The intimacy was more overwhelming than any threat he'd ever made. It was a silent admission of need, a crack in his formidable wall. I leaned into his palm, closing my eyes, savoring the rough texture of his skin. "Then stop," I whispered, reaching up to grip his forearm, feeling the coiled power beneath the wool of his sweater. "Stop being a king for 5 minutes." Roman groaned, a sound of pure tortured desire. Saan leaned down. His lips brushed against my forehead, then my temple, before hovering just over mine. The heat radiating from him was staggering, a living furnace. "If I start," he whispered against my mouth, his breath hitching, "I won't be able to stop until you are marked, mated, and screaming my name. Run, Elena, while you still have the legs to carry you." Chapter 13. The Intruder. The peace shattered on a Tuesday. I was in the garden practicing the breathing exercises Roman had suggested to help manage my heightened senses when the air turned foul. It didn't smell like cedar or rain. It smelled like wet dog and rotting meat. I froze, my hackles rising in a way that was distinctly unhuman. A man I didn't recognize was standing near the stone fountain, his expensive suit too tight across his bulging muscles. Now he was younger than Roman, with a cruel, narrow face and eyes that held none of the depth or pain of my alpha. This was a man who enjoyed the ruthless part of the job without any of the responsibility. He looked at me with a sneer that made my skin crawl, his gaze traveling over my body with the clinical detachment of a butcher. "So this is the little human bitch Roman is risking the crown for," the stranger said, his voice a nasal whine. "I expected something more. You look like a stiff breeze would blow you over." He took a step toward me, and I felt a low, vibrating hum start in the center of my chest. It wasn't fear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. I was furious that this interloper was in my sanctuary, insulting the man who had given me a reason to breathe again. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice steady, surprising even myself. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I'm the man who's going to take his territory when the council realizes he's gone soft on a human toy. You're a liability, sweetheart, and liabilities get removed." He moved toward me, his hand reaching out as if to grab my hair. I expected to scream. I expected to cower. Instead, a sound ripped from my throat that I didn't recognize. A deep, guttural growl that shook my very ribs. My vision shifted, the colors bleeding away until everything was sharp, high-contrast silver and shadow. The stranger froze, his eyes widening in genuine shock. "What the hell?" he hissed, backing away. The air around me began to shimmer with heat. The fever returning with a vengeance, but this time I wasn't a victim to it. I was the source. I felt my fingernails sharpen, my teeth aching with a sudden pulsing pressure. "Get out!" The words didn't sound like mine. They were layered, backed by a feral resonance that made the birds in the trees go silent. The stranger looked like he was seeing a ghost. You're not human," he stammered, his bravado crumbling. Before he could say another word, a black blur exploded from the terrace. Roman hit the ground between us, his transformation mid-shift, his body a terrifying hybrid of man and wolf. He let out a roar that shattered the windows of the conservatory, a sound of such pure protective rage that the intruder turned and fled toward the gates without looking back. Roman didn't chase him. He turned to me, his eyes glowing like dying stars, his face a mask of awe and horror. The transition had truly begun. Yes, my legs gave out as a white-hot pain sliced through my spine. "Roman," I gasped, falling toward the grass. He caught me, his touch the only thing keeping me from shattering. "It's time, Elena," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The wolf is coming." Chapter 14. The Shift. The world didn't just break. It reconfigured itself through a symphony of snapping bone and stretching sinew. I was on the floor of Roman's private study, my fingers digging into the thick Persian rug as the first wave of the transition hit me like a high-speed freight train. It was an agony so exquisite it felt like being reborn in the heart of a star. Every joint in my body seemed to pop and realign. A violent architectural overhaul that should have killed me. Yet I felt more alive in the center of the pain than I had in 24 years of safety. Roman was there, a solid, immovable mountain of heat against my back. He didn't hover or panic, he simply anchored me. His large, scarred hands were locked onto mine, and I could feel him pulling the jagged edges of my suffering into himself. His own body acting as a lightning rod for the overflow of my transformation. It was the ultimate intimacy, a literal sharing of a soul being torn apart and stitched back together with silver thread. "Breathe, Elena," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum against my ear that acted as a tether to my fading humanity. "Don't fight the change. If you fight it, it will break you. Let the wolf take what she needs." I let out a jagged, animalistic cry as my spine elongated, the sensation of my skin stretching to accommodate a new form, making me lightheaded. But the sexual tension that had been building for weeks hadn't vanished. It had morphed into something primal and ravenous. I could smell the sweat on his skin, the salt and the musk, and it smelled like the only air I ever wanted to breathe. My senses were exploding. I could hear the mice in the walls, the heartbeat of the trees outside, and the frantic, heavy thud of Roman's heart against my shoulder. He was terrified for me, a realization that made me want to howl with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. The Ruthless King was trembling, his forehead pressed against mine, as he whispered words of encouragement in a language that wasn't human, but that my blood understood perfectly. The pain reached a crescendo, a white-hot spike that drove all thought from my mind. I arched my back, and my fingers turning into claws that shredded the expensive fabric of Roman's shirt. I felt him strip away his own remaining clothes, his skin meeting mine in a desperate, feverish slide of heat. There was no shame, only necessity. I needed his touch to survive the fire, and he needed to be the one to stoke it. "I've got you," he growled, his voice breaking as he felt my ribs shift beneath his palms. "I'm right here. I'm not letting go." The room seemed to dissolve into a swirl of shadows and moonlight, the scent of cedar and rain becoming so thick it was a physical weight. I gave one final gut-wrenching scream, not of agony, but of release, as the last of the human girl named Elena was eclipsed by the creature rising from the depths of my DNA. Chapter 15. The White Wolf. When I opened my eyes, the world was no longer gray. It was a masterpiece of silver, violet, and deep pulsing blues. I wasn't looking through human eyes anymore. I was standing on 4 powerful legs, my fur a startling, pristine white that shimmered like moonlight against the dark forest floor. The transition was complete, and with it came a sense of freedom so profound I felt like I could leap over the moon itself. The heavy, leaden weight of my past, the memories of Carl, the years of cowering, the fear of the dark, was gone, replaced by a fierce, predatory joy. I let out a tentative yip, which quickly deepened into a long melodic howl that echoed through the valley, announcing my arrival to the world. I wasn't a broken human girl. I was a rare, lethal beauty, a ghost of the woods. A shadow detached itself from the trees, a massive black wolf that made my new form look delicate by comparison. Roman. His wolf was a nightmare of muscle and midnight, his golden eyes the only light in his dark face. He circled me once, his movements a masterclass in lethal grace, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic wag that sent a thrill of recognition through my core. He didn't approach with aggression. He approached with a reverence that made my wolf's heart swell. He nudged his nose against mine, the contact sending a fresh wave of that electric heat through my fur. We were truly mates now, 2 halves of a violent, beautiful whole. With a playful nip at his ear, I turned and bolted into the deep woods, my paws barely touching the earth. The chase was on. We ran for hours, a blur of black and white through the ancient pines. I had never felt such power. Such absolute control over my own body. We hunted a stag, not out of hunger, but for the sheer exhilarating rush of the coordinated strike, Roman driving the prey toward me while I waited in the tall grass like a silver scythe. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, we slowed to a halt in a secluded glade by a hidden waterfall. The air was cool, but we were radiating heat. Roman shifted back first, the transition smooth and effortless for him, standing naked and unashamed in the morning light. I followed suit, the change back to human form, feeling like a soft sigh after a long scream. I stood before him, breathless and bare, the white wolf still humming just beneath my skin. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a man. Not lust, not pity, but pure, unadulterated worship. Chapter 16. Marked and Mated. The return to the manor was a silent, charged walk. Roman's arm draped over my shoulders, as if he were afraid I might vanish back into the trees. The moment we crossed the threshold of his bedroom, the door didn't just close. It slammed with a finality that signaled the end of our waiting. The slow-burn tension that had nearly driven us both mad finally boiled over. There was no more talking, no more ultimatums, and no more hesitation. He pressed me against the heavy oak door, his hands finding the curve of my hips with a possessive hunger that made me whimper. "I have waited a lifetime for you," he rasped, his voice a dark caress against my throat. "I have stalked you, I have envied you, and now I am going to claim you so thoroughly that no one, not even you, will ever doubt where you belong." He worshipped my body with a ferocity that was both terrifying and healing. Every touch was designed to erase a memory of pain, replacing the ghosts of my past with the burning reality of his touch. He wasn't gentle, but he was careful, his strength a controlled storm that I welcomed with open arms. When he finally sank into me, the bond snapped into place with a physical force that made the room spin. It was the blending of two broken things into one unbreakable weapon. I arched into him, my nails leaving fresh marks on his back, my voice a ragged refrain of his name. This wasn't the business transaction we had started with. It was a soul-deep recognition. I was the anchor for his rage, and he was the shield for my vulnerability. And the climax was a shattering of every wall I had ever built. In the height of our passion, Roman leaned down, his teeth grazing the junction of my neck and shoulder. "Mine," he growled, the word of vibration that settled into my very marrow. I felt the sharp, sudden sting of his canines as he bit down, marking me, sealing our fates in a way that could never be undone. A surge of his alpha power flooded through me, a golden tide of strength and belonging that made me feel like I could conquer the world. As we lay together afterward, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets and the lingering scent of our union, he pulled me flush against his chest. He didn't look like a ruthless king anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found home. "I loved you before I even knew your name, Elena," he whispered into the crook of my neck. And I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving it. Chapter 17. The Queen of His Rage. The heavy velvet curtains of the master suite were drawn back, allowing the morning sun to spill across the bed in long golden ribbons that felt almost as warm as the man tangled around me. 6 months ago, I was a ghost in a house of horrors, counting the seconds between footsteps and praying to be invisible. Now I sat at the vanity, watching my own reflection with a sense of wonder that hadn't faded since the night I shifted. There was a glow to my skin that no cosmetic could mimic, and my eyes, once dull and shadowed with perpetual fatigue, now held a sharp amber spark that mirrored Roman's. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a predator in silk. I reached for a diamond pendant, but a pair of large, scarred hands beat me to it. Roman appeared behind me, his massive frame swallowing my reflection. He was shirtless, his skin a roadmap of the battles he'd fought for his pack, and the marks I'd left on him just hours ago. He fastened the clasp, his knuckles brushing against the sensitive mark on my neck, sending a familiar, delicious shiver racing down my spine. "The council is waiting in the grand hall, little wolf," he rumbled, his voice still thick with the gravel of sleep and satisfied hunger. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply as if my scent were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "They're terrified, of course. They've heard rumors that their new queen has a bite even sharper than the king's. I told them they were being dramatic. But I might have failed to mention how much you enjoyed drawing blood last night." I turned in his arms, looping my hands around his neck and tugging him down until our foreheads rested together. "They should be terrified," I whispered, my thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You taught me well, Roman. A king's rage is a tool, but a queen's is a weapon. Besides, if they give me any trouble, I'll just tell them you're a big softy who likes to be scratched behind the ears." Roman let out a dark, vibrant chuckle that vibrated through my chest. "Careful, Elena. If word gets out that the Ruthless Alpha King is domestic, I'll have to burn down a village just to save my reputation." We walked into the council chamber hand in hand, a unified front of black and white, power and grace. The room went silent the moment we entered, as these were the men who had called me a human breeder and a stray. But today, they didn't even dare to meet my gaze. I sat in the chair beside Roman's throne, an equal seat he'd commissioned the week after our mating, and watched as he dismantled their petty political grievances with the cold, efficient ruthlessness that had made him a legend. But I saw the difference now. His rage wasn't a chaotic storm anymore. It was a harnessed energy, anchored by the bond that hummed between us. He glanced at me every few minutes, his hand finding mine under the table, his thumb stroking my palm in a slow rhythmic motion that was far more distracting than any of the boring tax reports they were reciting. The sexual tension was a living thing, a private conversation held in the middle of a public meeting, it reminding me that the moment these doors closed, he would be mine again. The meeting was drawing to a close when a scout burst through the heavy oak doors, his face pale and his breathing ragged. The sudden intrusion made Roman's hand tighten on mine, his wolf instantly surfacing, a low growl starting in the back of his throat. "Alpha, forgive the interruption," the scout gasped, dropping to one knee. "But we found something at the northern perimeter. A man was trying to bypass the scent barriers. He was battered, nearly dead, but he was carrying a locket with a crest we didn't recognize." Roman stood, his aura of power expanding until the very air in the room felt heavy enough to choke on. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice a lethal blade. The scout looked up, his eyes darting to me with a look of profound confusion and pity. "He wouldn't give a name, Alpha, but he kept screaming that he was looking for his daughter. He said his name was Thomas, and he looks exactly like the man in the portrait in the Queen's private study." The world tilted on its axis. My father had been dead for 10 years, or so my stepmother had told me the day she sold me to Carl. I felt the color drain from my face as I stood, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Roman was at my side in an instant, his arm wrapping around my waist, his golden eyes searching mine for any sign of a break. The peace we had built, the safety I had finally begun to trust, felt like it was being pulled apart by a single sentence. "He's dead," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to that scared girl in the rain. "He died in the accident." Roman turned to the scout. And at me, his gaze softening with a desperate, fierce love. "If he's telling the truth, Elena, then someone has been playing a very long, very dangerous game with your life. What a journey it's been from that cold, rain-slicked street to the golden halls of the Blackwood estate." Elena finally found her voice, but as that final revelation proves, her story is only just beginning. If you felt the heat of Roman's protective rage or cheered for the moment Elena's white wolf finally broke free, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our pack here. at Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. It truly helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss a new release. I would love to hear from you today. What was your favorite moment from this story? And where in the world are you listening from? Let's see how far the Blackwood influence reaches. And for those of you who want to dive even deeper into the pack's secrets, consider joining our channel membership. Our members get exclusive perks, early access to new audiobooks, and special badges that show your status in the inner circle. It's the best way to support the library and keep these stories coming. Before you go, I have to ask, do you think Roman should trust this man claiming to be Elena's father? Or is this a trap set by the council to test the Alpha King's new weakness? I'll be in the comments reading all your theories. Until next time, stay wild.